أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي خلق السماوات والأرض وجعل الظلمات والنور ثم الذين كفروا بربهم يعدلون. هو الذي خلقكم من طين ثم قضى أجلا وأجل مسمى عنده ثم أنتم تمترون. وهو الله في السماوات وفي الأرض يعلم سركم وجهركم ويعلم ما تكسبون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. فقد كذبوا بالحق لما جاءهم فسوف يأتيهم أنباء ما كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا من قبلهم من قرن مكناهم في الأرض ما لم نمكن لكم مكناهم في الأرض ما لم نمكن لكم وأرسلنا السماء عليهم مدرارا وجعلنا الأنهار تجري من تحتهم فأهلكناهم بذنوبهم فأهلكناهم بذنوبهم وأنشأنا من بعدهم قرنا آخرين ولو نزلنا عليك كتابا في قرطاس فلمسوه بأيديهم لقال الذين كفروا إن هذا إلا سحر مبين وقالوا لولا أنزل عليه ملك ولو أنزلنا ملكا لقضي الأمر ثم لا ينظرون ولو جعلناه ملكا لجعلناه رجلا وللبسنا عليهم ما يلبسون ولقد استهزئ برسل من قبلك فحاق بالذين سخروا منهم ما كانوا به يستهزئون قل سيروا في الأرض ثم انظروا كيف كان عاقبة المكذبين صدق الله العظيم.
अब्बास अली फख्रे शुजान अरब है, ये वारिस शमशीर शहंशाह नजफ है। तिफली से जिहादों में रहे बाप के हमरा, तिफली से जिहादों में रहे बाप के हमरा। मौला सा बहादुर कोई कौनैन में कब है, عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے، کہتا ہے زمانہ انہیں ماہ بنی ہاشم، کہتا ہے زمانہ انہیں ماہ بنی ہاشم، حیدر کا پسر سارے قبیلے کا شرف ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے، یہ قوت بازو حسین ابن علی ہے، یہ قوت بازو حسین ابن علی ہے، یہ ناز ہے بابا کا، یہ مادر کا شرف ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے، اڑتا ہے عجب شان سے عباس کا پرچم، اڑتا ہے عجب شان سے عباس کا پرچم، سرخم کیے تعظیم سے ہر جن و ملک ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے آج اسی فخر دو عالم کی ولادت، ہے آج اسی فخر دو عالم کی ولادت، بندوں پہ یہ ہے فضل خدا رحمت رب ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے، ظاہر ہے اسی بات سے حضرت کی فضیلت، ظاہر ہے اسی بات سے حضرت کی فضیلت، عباس علی باپ کی زینت کا سبب ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے، جس جا ہے علم بھائی کا ان کا بھی علم ہے، جس جا ہے علم بھائی کا ان کا بھی علم ہے، شبیر سے عباس جدا آج بھی کب ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے، یہ وارث شمشیر شہنشاہ نجف ہے، عباس علی فخر شجاعان عرب ہے۔
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله بارئ الخلائق أجمعين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين أرواحنا له فداء أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم تر إلى الملئ من بني إسرائيل من بعد موسى إذ قالوا لنبي لهم ابعث لنا ملكا نقاتل في سبيل الله قال هل عسيتم إن كتب عليكم القتال ألا تقاتلوا قالوا وما لنا ألا نقاتل في سبيل الله وقد أخرجنا من ديارنا وأبنائنا ولما كتب عليهم القتال تولوا إلا قليلا منهم والله عليم بالظالمين صدق الله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, I congratulate all of you on the auspicious occasion which we are celebrating tonight, and that is the birthday of Abul Fadl Abbas, Abbas ibn Ali al-Murtada alayhi salatu wasalam. Abul Fadl Abbas, the brother of Imam Hussein. As we begin our lectures in celebrating the great personalities who were born in this blessed month of Sha'ban, the birthday of Zainab al-Kubra, the birthday of Imam Zainab al-Kubra alayhi salam, the birthday of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, the birthday of Abu Fadl Abbas alayhi salam, and the birthday of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salatu wasalam. The discussion was about the principles or the pillars, rather, of an Islamic society. How do we measure a society and their degree of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or their degree of righteousness? And we mentioned that the pillars of an Islamic society are three. The qa'idatul iman, first the principle of faith, and then the qa'idatul istiqama, the principle of being steadfast on a path of justice, and the third qa'idatul hurriya, the principle of freedom. Now, in order to understand this, our focus has been on verse 246 of Surah Al-Baqarah, because this, in some sense, paints for us a picture and understanding of these principles within an Islamic society, or rather a righteous society. Of course, if we look at the verse literally, we understand that the folks that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about here are Bani Israel. But nonetheless, the purpose for this verse and what the objective is that Bani Israel, some of them, or many of them, were seeking to establish a society wherein people submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were practicing Islam, and the only deen and the only faith that all of our prophets, from Adam to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, that they brought was Islam, a state of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is regardless of the laws changing, the laws about the fast, how one fasts at that time versus now, the laws of prayer, what the form of prayer was then versus the form of prayer now. The core of that way of life was a life of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, personal submission, but also the society in its whole submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then justice will be established. So it's not alone that faith, that one testifies of faith, say that La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in our case, or whether they testify to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala following the revelation of the prophets who came before. But they did not remain steadfast. And this, which is the second pillar of the Islamic society, qa'idatul istiqama, to remain steadfast, because simply saying that one believes is not enough alone. If we look at verse 246 of Surah Al-Baqarah, we see that Bani Israel, they asked their prophet to send forth a king for us, that we will throw off the yoke of oppression from those who are weak and disenfranchised. Nuqatil fi sabilillah. We will throw off the yoke of oppression and lift up those oppressed individuals for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as we read in the verse, that most of them, they did not do this. Many of them turned back. تَوَلُّوا إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِنْهُمْ. Many of them turned back. I mean, if you look at the life of these great personalities that we are celebrating their birth in these first 3 days of Sha'aban, we see that all of them have a connection with Karbala. And we know the situation of Karbala, that they all stood on the side of justice, on the side of righteousness, on the side of standing up for those who were weak and oppressed, championing justice. But how many people came to their aid and stood behind them? So verse 246 of Surah Al-Baqarah, it captures kind of the core of their life and what they stood for. And also these principles of an Islamic society, these principles or pillars of a society that is righteous and in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So after the principle of faith, after those individuals in that society as a whole, they accept the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They accept that authority must come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They accept the principle of La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, or La ilaha illallah, and the Tawheed, and whichever prophet they were supposed to follow. This is not important, but what we're speaking about is the core of that message. Once they accept that authority goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they have to remain steadfast. Because simply saying it is not any good if you cannot back it up, if you cannot fortify that. And that's what the second principle is, remaining steadfast, istiqamah. So if we look at verse 246 of Surah Al-Baqarah, we notice that first and foremost the Bani Israel, they are trying to, as I said, throw off that yoke of oppression. They ask the Prophet for the king that nuqatil fi sabilillah. However, the Prophet himself, he poses a very important question to Bani Israel, to these people who are asking him. And this is a nation of believers, Bani Israel. The prophets of Israel, they came to them. So he says, هَلْ عَسَيْتُمْ إِن كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَابِ أَلَّا تُقَاتِلُوا. He says that you're requesting to stand in the face of injustice, to overturn or remove the yoke of oppression from the women, the children, the weak, the elderly. And so he says, will you truly stand? If it has been prescribed for you, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers this request of yours to appoint for you a king to help you stand up against injustice, will you follow? Will you engage? And so this was the question. This is the idea and concept of istiqamah. This is what we see in the life of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afsalatu wassalam in their entirety. This is what we see specifically in the life of these great personalities born in these first 3 days of the blessed month of Sha'ban, in Zainab al-Kubra, in Imam Hussein, in Abu Fadl Abbas, in Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhim afsalatu wassalam. We see this quality in all of them. So, as that question has been posed, one thing we also understand from that question, folks who are in a position of leadership, especially in that position of leadership like Imam Hussein was, those who had some responsibility with regards to that leadership, like Zainab al-Kubra, like Abu Fadl Abbas, and of course Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi, he's in that position of authority as well. One thing that they must do as well is to really look at those people who are around them and who's making this claim. That are they really sincere? Are these individuals those who are not simply saying that they believe, but they are firm upon their belief, they are steadfast upon that path of justice? Just like we see in the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, where one of the individuals from Khurasan came to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and told him, he says, look, again, this rivalry between Bani Umayyah and Bani Abbas, he said, it's ripe, and he requested Imam Sadiq, as I said, if you step forward and you lead us, then we will follow and we will have victory, and the Ahlul Bayt will be returned back to their rightful position as those who have authority and divine authority over the Ummah. Of course, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, in a very similar way, in his own way, says, هَلْ عَسَيْتُمْ إِن كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالَ أَلَّا تُقَاتِلُوا. He tested them. He says, will you remain steadfast if I really called upon you, or even those thousands of people that you're telling me about who are willing to stand? So he said yes. So as he said yes, one of the servants of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was coming through. Very famous story, but very beautiful story, so that we can understand this idea and concept of being steadfast on the path of justice, being steadfast in following those who have authority from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Imam al-Ma'soom, he told this servant, he says, enter into this tanur, into this oven. And so the servant, without asking a question, he walked in. And when this person who came from Khurasan to request Imam Sadiq to rise up and to have his own faction that are against the Umayyads, and perhaps also went out over the Abbasids, when he saw this, he said, he says, what are you doing? The Imam is not supposed to harm anyone. So Imam Sadiq, he told this servant to come out. The servant came out. Not a scratch on the servant, not a burn, not even the clothes were burned. And so this Khurasani, he looked astonished. So Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he asked this Khurasani, he says that, how many of those individuals that you're telling me, those thousands of individuals who they will follow me if I rose up against the Umayyads and even challenge the Abbasid revolution, what they were doing, how many of them are like this one servant in their obedience to me? Again, and that obedience to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is exactly as Imam Hussein had stated, that فَاللَّهُ أَوْلَى بِالْحَقِّ, that authority, Imam Sadiq would not take that authority simply for himself. No, that authority is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's delegating that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would want. So he asks, how many are like this? This individual from Khurasan, he says, I swear by God that none of them are like this. He says, not even myself. At that point, Imam Sadiq, he says, if you give me 5 like this, he says, then I can take my rightful place at the helm of the Ummah. So this quality of being steadfast, it is a very serious quality or pillar as well of the Islamic society, or a society that is righteous, because those individuals will be righteous for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those individuals will stand upon haqq for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those who do not, those who swerve from that, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he states that many of them turned back in verse 246 of Surah Al-Baqarah, tawallu, that many of them, tawallu illa qalilan minhum, that many of them, when they were told to go forth, when Talut, he came as their king, and he told them, okay, you requested to remove this yoke of oppression from your necks, let's go forth, let's stand up for the oppressed, let's implement social justice. As many of them turned away. Many of them. Only a few, only a handful stayed. Similar to the case of Imam Hussein. Many people left. Many people left. Only a handful stayed. And of course, among those handfuls of these personalities which we are celebrating their birthdays, Zainab al-Kubra, Imam Hussein himself, Abu Fadl Abbas, Imam Zain al-Abidin, alayhim afsatu sam. But that remaining steadfast, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He points out in this verse 264, He says, Wallahu alimun bil-zalimin. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is aware of those who are oppressor. He's aware of those who are, you could say, not righteous. But these are the zalimin. Those individuals who, again, they were requesting, ib'ath lana malikan. But they didn't remain steadfast. Remaining steadfast as well, having this istiqamah, also means knowing how to achieve justice, because it may be different at different times. And this is one of the things that we understand if we truly examine the life of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu salam, then we see that the actions, of course, first and foremost of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was a path of justice. As Imam Hussein, he stated, I'm walking in the footsteps of my grandfather Rasulullah and in the footsteps of my father Amir al-Mu'mineen. These were the paths of justice, of righteousness. Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi also walked in a path of justice, but in order to maintain and achieve even a measure of righteousness in society, in order for that society not to because they swerve further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or those principles of righteousness, Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi he had to make peace with Bani Umayyah, with Muawiyah, make that peace treaty. Why? Because if the internal conflict would have started and there was this civil war, this would have been more detrimental to Islam at the time, more detrimental to the righteousness of the society. In the time of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he had to rise up, he had to stand up, because by not doing so and having everyone to make bay'ah to Yazid, and Yazid was someone who openly drank, he openly did a lot of things which were against Islam, then that was more detrimental to Islam. Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, that he sent, mostly he made dua, his supplications, and of course through his supplications he was educating the ummah. Through his actions, بغير ألسنتي, in other words, without even his tongue, he was standing up against the oppression. He was standing up for the oppressed, for the poor, the disenfranchised, with his actions. And that was what was needed at that time in order to achieve justice. That was the istiqamah of that time. So istiqamah, being steadfast on that path of justice, not only requires one to be firm in their position, but also have the wisdom and the hikmah of understanding what to do at the time, or for the time that they're living in, or in the place that they're living in. So as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He states in Surah Al-Fussilat, chapter 41 of the Quran, verse 30, He says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا بِالْجَنَّةِ الَّتِي كُنْتُمْ تُوعَدُونَ. So when it comes to this idea and concept of istiqamah, remaining steadfast, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that a person, first and foremost, must have faith. That's the first pillar of an Islamic society. That faith is important. But it's not the only thing. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ. They accept Tawheed. They will accept the authority coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah, He has all power, all authority. تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also delegates that authority to whomever He wills. يؤتي الملك من يشاء. So He will give it to whomever He wills. So this is when a person says ربنا الله, They accept those principles of authority. ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا. And then they stay on those principles of authority. They hold fast to those principles. They hold fast to those who have wilayat and authority over them. Proper wilayat and authority. That wilayat and authority that is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that they remain steadfast on that path, on their lifestyle. And if one does so, تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ أَلَّا تَخَافُوا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will send down the angels to help them, to aid them, to assist them, so that they will not fear. And why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do this? Because that path of the Prophet, the lifestyle of the prophets, the lifestyle of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afsat wasalam, lifestyle of the awliya is not an easy lifestyle. And this is because there will be so many temptations to, you know what, it's easier just to remain silent and not to stand up for the oppressed. It is easier to remain silent and not to object against the oppression that is happening. That is easier than to speak out, to remain steadfast. And this is why the Prophet, he asks, he says that if you were required, هَلْ عَسَيْتُمْ إِن كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالِ أَلَّا تُقَاتِلُوا. That if you were really required by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to go forth, to make a stance, will you not stand? And the people, they question even the Prophet. They says, what is it? Why shouldn't we go forth and why shouldn't we stand if we were told to stand? Especially when, we were removed from our homes. أُخْرِجْنَا مِنْ دِيَارِنَا وَأَبْنَائِنَا. So we were kicked out of our homes. We were also our children, our families. We were removed from our homes. This is what Bani Israel said. This was their response when they were asked by the Prophet that, will you stand if you were required to stand? They said, well, why wouldn't we? When we've been oppressed, we've been kicked out of our home, our children have been kicked out. So we will stand. The believer who walks that path, the path of the Prophet, the path of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who have faith and those who have will stand firmly. They will be steadfast on that path of justice. Without doubt, they will face difficulty. Without doubt, they will have some sort of difficulty in their life. And so therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them that, look, the angels will be with you. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will send down these angels. أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. That don't fear. Don't be afraid. And do not be saddened that when you look around, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in verse 246 of Surah Baqarah, when you look around, many people would have left. Many people would have left. And you will only remain a small group, just as Imam Hussein and his companions. وَأَبْشِرُوا بِالْجَنَّةِ. Realize that when you walk this path, you're on a path towards paradise, towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's reward. الَّتِي كُنْتُمْ تُوعَدُونَ. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised. And that beautiful example of steadfastness we find in Abu Fadl Abbas. Of course, the people of Kufa, they, like the Bani Israel of that time, they said that, oh, hey, we will stand with you. They wrote letters, thousands of letters to Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. But when it came time for them to respond, and it came time for them to live up to what they stated, they did not have istiqamah. And this is why Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he said about them, he says, أَصْبَحْتُمْ أَلْبًا عَلَىٰ أَوْلِيَائِكُمْ وَيَدًا لِأَعْدَائِكُمْ مِنَ غَيْرِ عَدْلٍ. He says that you have become a force or a band against your awliya, against those who truly have authority over you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did he not say that the believers, al-mu'minun ba'duhum awliya'u ba'dan ya'muruna bil ma'ruf yanhauna 'anil munkar, that the believers have walaya over one another, authority over one another, by virtue of them doing amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, enjoining one another to what is good and forbidding them from what is wrong. Imam Hussein alayhi salatu, he left from Medina, and everyone who left from Medina left with that mission that Imam Hussein alayhi salatu mentioned, in order to do islah, in order to correct the ills and the wrongs of the ummah of Rasulullah, in order to do amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, in order to walk in the footsteps of Rasulullah and of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu. So he says, the people of Kufa, you recognize this. You called us towards Kufa to establish justice, to stand up for those who are oppressed in Kufa and in the ummah of Rasulullah. But as they came, he says, Asbahtum alban ala awliyaikum. You join forces in opposition to those who have walayat over you. وَيَدًا لِأَعْدَائِكُمْ. And not simply that they became a force and a support for their enemy, their own enemies. بِغَيْرِ عَدْلٍ. Without any justification. In fact, going against that which was just and right at the time. And of course we see this when we read the history of Karbala and what led up to the day of Ashura, that when Ibn Ziyad, he came into Kufa, again, many of the people, they were shouting and chanting the praise of Imam Hussein, stating that they will support him. But then Ibn Ziyad came in and he made them to surrender their weapons. He called the women, surrender your weapons and take gold instead. He paid them for their weapons, to surrender their weapons, so that they would not fight against the forces of wickedness. They would not fight against the oppressors, Yazid and his men. And then he paid them again, Ibn Ziyad. Right before going out to the battlefield of Karbala, he paid them again. To do what? To take their arms. So come back to me, take your weapons, we will pay you, and we will pay you to stand in opposition to Imam Hussein. And this is why Imam Hussein says that you band against your awliya, against those who have authority, and you became the support of those who are the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who are your own enemies. And unfortunately, this happens if we look at history time and time again. It is repeated. And why is this repeated? We say, oh, well, there are thousands who are believers. And I'm not speaking about any particular religion, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam. When they say that, oh, they believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they believe in the prophets that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent. So why are they weak in their righteousness or establishing a society based on the principles of justice, based on divine justice? It's because the istiqamah is weak. Perhaps in some areas, oh, well, they have this istiqamah, they'll do a little chant and here, but then when it comes to actually standing firm based on the principles of justice, or actually understanding how to implement it. Unfortunately, sometimes people do not understand how to implement and what their particular time calls for. This is the area in which many have shaken. They have not been able to be firm, and instead of being a support for their awliya, being a support for the Prophet and for the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afsalatu, they became a band and a force against the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afsalatu. But one good example that we have of this steadfastness, istiqamah, is Abu Fadl Abbas, who we're celebrating his birthday today, as he stood with Imam Hussein. And imagine this, and so that we truly understand the istiqamah of Abu Fadl Abbas. That before the battle of Karbala began, the battle on the day of Ashura began, Shimr, who had a relationship with Abu Fadl Abbas from his mother's side, from the side of al-Benin. They were related through tribal affiliation. So they said that Shimr, he shouted out that, where are the sons of my sister? Meaning, where are the sons of al-Benin? That she's part of our tribe, so her tribe is part of our tribe, we're affiliated. And Abu Fadl Abbas, he did not respond, nor did any of his brothers. So Shimr again, he shouted out, where's Abbas? Called him by name. Where's Abbas and his brothers? So at that point, Imam Hussein alayhi salatu, because Abu Fadl Abbas did not want to respond, Imam Hussein, he told Abbas, he says, answer this call. Do not be disrespectful in this manner. He's calling, and he called you now by your name, so go forth and respond to him. So Abu Fadl Abbas, he came forth, of course with his brothers, but Abu Fadl Abbas, representing his brothers and the children of al-Benin, went to see what Shimr was requesting. So Shimr told him, Shimr al-Ayn, he says that, don't get yourself killed with Hussein. And maintain obedience to the commander of the faithful, Yazid. So Shimr was offering him security that, if you come, you stay with us, then you won't be killed, and I assure you that you will be safe. So Abu Fadl Abbas, his response is that, you can keep this security, and may God curse this security of yours, is that you're granting me amn, you're granting me security. But you refuse to grant security to Ibn Rasulullah, the son of Rasulullah, that beloved grandson of Rasulullah, that the Prophet of Allah, he would stop his speeches if Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, they came into the Masjid of Medina when the Prophet was speaking. You will not grant him security, but you will grant me security. So this is one part of the istiqamah of Abu Fadl Abbas. No matter that, if I went with this side, I would spare my life, spare my son's life. No, Abu Fadl Abbas, he had to remain firm on that path of justice, steadfast on that path of justice. So much so, Abbas, alayhi salam, he remained on that path of justice, that Abu Fadl Abbas, being the great warrior that he was. In fact, many of those youth who went out on the battlefield of Karbala, Qasim, Muhammad his own brothers, that it was Abu Fadl Abbas who had trained them in the art and the skill of being fighters and being warriors. But